Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm your host for this episode, Jamar Tisby, and I'm joined by Diana Butler-Bass,
Hey there.
Kristen Dumais,
Hey, Jamar, good to be with you.
and Robby Jones.
Hey, everybody.
We are each scholars, three historians, and one sociologist who write about religion and its intersection with culture, history, and politics in America. The way it works, somebody introduces a topic. We don't know what we're going to say, and so we give you our authentic, honest responses in the moment. That's why it's called the Convocation Unscripted. This episode of the Convocation Unscripted is now in session. As we record this, we come to you all on a very somber moment. There was a tragic incident involving a plane crash and collision in Washington, D.C., and we have two local D.C. residents with us. So I wanted to turn it over to you, Robby and Diana, and just hear from you and hold space for this moment because in the rush of everything that's coming out and happening politically, I think we do need to pause and just assess and address the human impact of a lot of what's going on.
This morning I went for a walk right along the Potomac. I had an appointment in Alexandria where I live, and it's there's a beautiful pathway right along the river, and I love walking there in the morning when I'm in Old Town. And it was nearly silent over the river, which is really strange because almost always there's planes flying into the airport right there. And the only noise there was coming from the river were from rescue boats. And I could see those on my walk. And as I rounded one of the corners in the pathway, there were several fire and rescue vehicles from the Prince William County Department of Emergency emergency management, whatever it was. But that's the next county down from where I live. And it was just so hard and really chilling to think of those people having all died. That was clear by then. And that river so icy cold. It was almost like the river itself was weeping.
Yeah, I know it sits really close to home. I mean, that's typically my home airport. I've been in that place hundreds and hundreds of times and up and down that runway hundreds and hundreds of times on some of those small planes, like that one that held 68, I think, people, and four crew members on this, this kind of awful event yesterday. But it's also a place like you, Diana. There's a beautiful bike path, and it's one of my favorite biking places is to bike down because it's right down by the river and right past the airport down there. So yeah, I think it just my heart's been really really heavy today, just kind of taking that all. And last time we talked about the wildfires, kind of weighing on us, and now we've got something for you and I, Diana, that's really really close to home. This week. So we want to just open it up and just acknowledge it, sit with it, maybe even listeners who had people affected by it as well, and just, say our hearts are with everyone.
Yeah, it is a moment for us to collectively grieve. And I think it's a moment for us to, really reflect on what holds us together and on what our core values are, right? It just seems like such a deeply human moment that many of us, all of us, have struggles in our lives and tragedies, but something like this brings us all together, focused on one tragedy. And I do think it's a moment to, in the midst of all of the politics, and we're all, have our heads in that every waking moment. It feels like this just to me was a reminder of kind of basic humanity. And the sorrow that we feel on behalf of the families and the victims, and kind of what we all want, which is safety, security, having our family members come home to us at the end of the day. And to, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the responses, and we need to, and we ought to, but to just, keep ourselves grounded in that. And, I maybe someday again, our politics can be grounded in that as well.
We've never done this before on the Convocation Unscripted, and sadly, I sense that it may not be the last time, but I just want to actually have an actual moment of silence for the people who died. And like you said, Kristen, to remember our humanity and theirs. So let's just take a moment. These are times when leadership is critical. Who we are as a nation, who our leaders are, is most evident in times of crisis. So the president commented on this, and what were your reactions to what he said? Diana, let's begin with you.
Well, I think I'm unshockable at some level from what's going on, but I was appalled. That's a better word to describe the way I felt today. Because he did have a press conference, and I thought, okay, Diana, give this guy a chance. Maybe he'll rise to the occasion. And I turned the television on, and the first 3 or 4 sentences out of the president's mouth, I was impressed by. I mean, it sounded maybe less than completely genuine, but at least he read uh, a very nice statement of condolence that had been written for him, obviously. And so that was all right, did fine. And then he launched into an attack of Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Pete Buttigieg, and DEI, and turned the whole thing into this actually nightmare press conference, uh, criticizing all the people who were to blame and talking about himself then, about how he was going to fix everything. And his new transportation secretary, Sean Duffy, like, okay, the guy is a movie star who's now running the Department of Transportation. And so he came on and he reiterated all the stuff about DEI. And then J.D. Vance jumped to the microphone and did the exact same thing. I mean, literally, J.D. Vance was like a lapping dog, ready to just jump up there and support the president, and said all sorts of nasty stuff. And then, of course, they all started talking about how they were going to fire everybody at the FAA and replace them with people who were merit-based. And that was the press conference, and it was appalling, and it was disgusting.
You couldn't script something worse, really. How about anyone else? Initial impressions on that?
I mean, this just should have been a layup, right, for a new president. You've got one job when something like this happens. You call the nation together, you try to honor the people and respect the people who lost their lives and the families that are grieving and still trying to wrap their heads around this. You should be the comforter in chief, right? That's your one job. We don't have many facts. We don't have in terms of causes or but instead, like, he just couldn't even do that. I mean, that's the thing that makes me so angry, is like, this was a layup for any president, right? For anyone who, like, whatever you want to say, anyone who has a shred of human decency. I'm really angry about it. Just to kind of be a human being. And he couldn't just be human for more than 2 minutes, and then only because he was tethered to a teleprompter. But as soon as he got off of that, he's back to being the racist in chief. I mean, that's the only way to say it, right? That he turned a national tragedy into an opportunity to spew racist hatred.
and hatred against disabled people. He was specifically very cruel about disabled people in this particular press conference.
On this DEI thing, it's a broad effort, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some add the A, accessibility, that is designed almost like the Civil Rights Act to give historically marginalized and discriminated against groups a fair chance. And that's all it is. And this applies to women, Black people, other people of color, different races and ethnicities, different people of different abilities, all those things, where historically they wouldn't get a chance in a lot of industries, in a lot of positions. And so DEI is truly just designed to open doors of opportunity that are otherwise closed. It's not designed and has never been designed. And don't let anyone fool you or mislead you into saying that it was designed to give unqualified people a chance above and ahead of not only more qualified people, but the implication is more qualified, able-bodied, white, probably heterosexual people. So I keep saying that part of the general initiative of this administration is to reinscribe a social hierarchy in the nation that looks a lot like what we saw 100 years ago or 200 years ago, in which white moneyed men are at the pinnacle and everyone else kind of serves at their behest. And there's a lot of chatter online right now that when you hear that phrase or those letters DEI, it really means Black or the N-word or some sort of racially coded. Now we know it's broader than that, but also we know racism never goes away, it adapts. So if they can't say the specific word yet, we're already at the point of doing these salutes in public without any consequences. Then of course we should expect that they're going to use different phrases: DEI, CRT, woke, liberal, progressive, whatever label you want to use. Communist is what it used to be, to attack these groups that they think are just unworthy and unqualified. And we actually heard, someone brought up, we actually heard language that was very kind of eugenicist, race science kind of stuff. What was the phrase? Like these folks were inherently unqualified biologically to serve in these positions as pilots, air traffic controllers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, he was actually using language like that.
Yeah.
He specifically said that, and that, you know, it's already starting to show up on social media from the people who pay attention to facts and truth, that at least the co-pilot of the American Airlines flight was a 28-year-old white guy who had just gotten engaged to his fiance. And he honestly, the picture of the young man, he looks very, very nice. And frankly, he looks more Aryan than me. And so I DEI, well, where is this present? You know, I mean,
and it feels like there's a double harm here because, right, the harm of ginning up this hate, right, of just weaponizing everything instantly, just like the California fire. It's like anything that happens, DEI, unqualified people, like zero evidence. In fact, considerable evidence to the contrary, right? We know this is not true. So there's that. But then there's also, who is he currently in the process of replacing actual qualified federal workers with? People with no particular qualification except loyalty to him. That is what is happening here. That is what is happening across the federal government right now. Right? I've heard from friends who work in the National Archives and across different agencies right now. And what they're being told is essentially, you know, like they're using all different tools to get rid of folks so that they can replace them not with people who are better qualified. I mean, look at who's being elevated to cabinet positions now. Zero qualifications. The only qualification is loyalty. And you'll hear that over and over again. We need the people in these positions who will carry out not their constitutional duties, not their service to the country, who will carry out President Trump's bidding. That is the sole qualification.
Yeah. And that was evident in the hearings today, too. And yesterday with the RFK Jr. hearing. They really pressed him. Several of the senators really pressed him on these different points. And it wasn't just that he's completely not qualified, that he's a conspiracy theorist. It was literally, he kept saying his answer over and over and over again is, I will carry out what President Trump's policies are. I will carry out what President Trump's policies are. And they even cornered him on his own moral beliefs. They literally talked about your values, your beliefs, your morality, and how those things were, Trump's positions were violating things that he's said in public, long-standing. And so it was an incredible display of single-focused public loyalty to the leader.
Yeah. And, you know, we've got, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this next time too, but we've got Russell Vogt waiting in the wings here, who, and I wrote about a little bit about this week, you know, who in Project 2025 said he thought the entire job of like anybody in the government was to execute the commander's intent. Now, just think about the language of this for a moment, right? Not the president's intent. He's used a militaristic title for the president to describe his civic office, right? The commander's intent. So not government of, by, and for the people, but a government that is dedicated to carrying out the commander's intent. That's his actual language from Project 2025, right? And he's up next, right, in the confirmation hearings that we're about to see. But you know, two other things, just real quickly. I was thinking about so the Paris Review just unlocked one of James Baldwin's 1984 interviews this week. So 84, right? This is Reagan era, and I was struck by one little passage that I thought I would like share here. And he's talking about the post-civil rights era, right? Where and the struggles that were going on, and how it has shifted the terrain. So here's what he had to say, which I thought sounded like very, very relevant today. He says, well, you see, something has happened which no one has really noticed, but it's very important. Europe is no longer a frame of reference, a standard bearer, the classic model for literature and for civilization. It's not the measuring stick. There are other standards in the world. It's a fascinating time to be living. There's a whole wide world which isn't now as it was when I was younger. When I was a kid, the world was white for all intents and purposes. And now it is struggling to remain white, a very different thing. And I just really jumped off the page to me when I read that. And, you know, that is exactly what we're seeing before our eyes, right? In the sort of aftermath of our first African-American president. And that is Trump. We don't get Trump without Obama, right? And this is the playing out of parts of the United States trying so desperately to keep America white.
I recently just hours before we started recording, posted on Threads that they're still mad that a black man was president.
Yeah.
And I was speaking earlier today to a sociologist, Alexander Jun, and he's written several books about race and higher ed. He's all over this CRT and DEI stuff in his field. And one of the things that he said stuck out to me. He's like, you know, fear is a big part of what's motivating these actions, and certainly at the grassroots level, why people are signing on to these horrific, inhumane practices. But it's not simply a fear of change writ large. It's specifically a fear of loss. It's the fear that there is an America, a community, an identity that they're losing. Because change is okay as long as it benefits them. But it's the fear of losing something that they think they once had or were entitled to is motivating. It's not the only thing, but it's a big motivator for a lot of people. And I thought that was really important. And it's an important context that in, you know, the 1950s, let's say, the nation is far and away majority white all over the country. And no matter what pockets of racial and ethnic, numerically minority folks there were, it was still a white man's country. And that was never really in doubt. As the country has changed, as more people have been enfranchised through affirmative action, through DEI, through electing a black president, that fear of we're losing the America we once had. I also think, this is as an aside, pop culture reference, it's really interesting that the latest Captain America movie is coming out. And Anthony Mackie, who's a black man, plays Captain America now.
Oh, Lord have mercy, what we're
Yeah,
going to hear about
the
that.
original Captain America literally
Mhm.
passed his shield down to Anthony Mackie, who's played Falcon in the Marvel movies. And now in this movie, he's for the first time headlining it as Captain America. And I'm like, well, isn't that just fully appropriate? The symbol of the United States embodied in a person has changed from a white man to a black man. And that is actually part of the plot and the storyline, going back a long way. So I'm like,
So not
wow.
just Black Panther.
Yes, not just
Right.
Black Panther, right?
Yeah.
You know,
It's fascinating to me because, in effect, I think that all of this is like reifying all of the worst things about European cultures through history. The bigotry, the violence, the idea of salvation through inflicting suffering on others, the worst kinds of theological emphases that were present in Western Christianity. And in doing that, what they're actually doing is diminishing the possibility that the good things from European cultures survive. Because when we get to the other side of this, there are going to be so many people who just hate everything that has anything to do with it, is that there won't be the time of day, to even say, I like Bach, oh, you can't like Bach because Bach is evil, kind of thing. And the right path in this age that Baldwin was talking about was for people of European background to be able to take the good and the beauty of these cultures, of which there is and was much, and to celebrate those and put them in conversation with all of that, all of those other cultures around the world that were emerging. And I just have never understood how it diminishes me and my love of European painting or celebrating Christmas or my pride in my Scottish and German ancestors. It doesn't take a single thing away from me to be friends with all kinds of folks from all kinds of different cultural backgrounds, and to learn from the experiences of people who are different than me. It adds to my story. It doesn't take away. And I just do not understand why that wasn't the path that was taken in these 40 years. It breaks my heart.
yeah, Diana, you're talking about bad things in history. I don't think we're allowed to do that anymore. Just a note there.
Oh, well, maybe in another 5 years we can.
But I wanted to pick up on something that Robby mentioned, that language of commander. And I want to ground us just a bit in terms of understanding the moment we find ourselves in. Because if you listen to the people with the power, and if you paid attention to what they've been saying in Project 2025, in the talks that they give amongst themselves, people like Russ Vought, people like Kevin Roberts, they are very, very clear that we are in a war and that the enemy is us. Right? The four of us, and every single person who does not count themselves as a Trump loyalist, right? This is the left. These are the woke. This is all of these made up categories that are created with one intent: to demonize, right? To demonize. And again, they are very clear that this is war. All out war. And I think we need to remember that when we look at that press conference today, when we look at the response to the wildfires, when we look at literally every single thing that happens, every appointment, every response, every tweet, every comment, they are at war, and they have already very clearly identified us as the enemy that has to be destroyed. Now, I don't know what that means for how we mount a resistance, right? We can talk about humanity, we can talk about all these things, but there are a whole separate set of rules right now, right? Some of us are still trying to defend democracy, and we're trying to appeal to the common good, and we're trying to appeal to virtues of honesty and integrity. And I do not want to throw that away, but I just need everybody to be clear that that's not the game they are playing at all, and it's not a game for them.
How would you describe what they're doing, Kristen?
To absolutely, so the way they will describe it, right? The left has taken over this country, and has shaped this government, the administrative state, and the Constitution itself has been corrupted. So, how far back do you want to go? Pretty far back, right? So they see civil rights, absolutely, women's rights, many of them that as well. The whole kind of rights revolution, and social welfare, the whole package, all of it, equity, inclusion, all of it, everything that's happened in the last nearly century or so, certainly the post-war liberal order, all of that they see is evil and a corruption of what this country was meant to be. And so there is no compromise. They have said this. There is no compromise with the other side. And you can't just nudge. You have to destroy. You have to burn it down to the ground, right? And the revolution will be bloodless if the left allows it to be. They have been very, very clear about that. That is what we are living through right now. We're not just living through chaos. This isn't shock and awe. There is a deliberate strategy here, and they are carrying it out.
And just a reminder, like, why the sudden like ramp up and move to just openly now undermine democracy? The primary reason is that this is the moment, and they'll talk about it this way. We are at an apocalyptic moment. If we don't do this now, we will never have the power to do it again. And there's some truth to that, is the thing, right? Remember the number of white Christians in the country today, 41%. Even back at the turn of the century, it was 54%, right? At turn of the 21st century. So it is this kind of move from literally demographic majority to minority that has sent out this great freak out movement, and they know they can't get there through democratic means. Like, the numbers simply aren't there. And so they've just resorted to, and while that sounds like wild, and we got to remember, like, that the real history here, I say to the three historians sitting around me, is
Do tell.
that white Christians have never been for a pluralistic democracy in this country, right? They've been for a white democracy in this country. So the whole idea of a true pluralistic democracy, this is something that is actually a fairly new challenge for white Christians to wrap their heads around and actually get behind.
Robby, I want to stick with you for a second. Do you remember, putting you on the spot as a sociologist, the sort of differences where there was a data point about the willingness of white Christian nationalists to say violence might be necessary to bring about desired political ends?
Yeah.
Can you recall that?
Yeah, no, if you look at the people who are fully committed, like the Christian nationalist adherents is the term we have today. And when you ask them, do you agree or disagree that because things have gotten so far off track, there's your apocalyptic like tip of the hat, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. It's nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalist adherents who say yes. to that question. It's down in single digits for the Christian nationalist rejectors on the other end of the scale. So there's no real comparison here. And the other two data points to kind of add a little data amen to Kristen's pretty fantastic monologue just a minute ago is like the thing is, you mentioned the 50s come up, a couple 1950s come up. The other number that has always stayed with me, we've asked this a number of times on PRI surveys, still one of the biggest divides between the two political parties is whether or not they think that American life was better in the 1950s or not. So if you ask, do you think that American way of life was better or worse since the 1950s? It's 2/3 of Republicans who say it was it's worse than it was in the 1950s, and it's 2/3 of Democrats who say it's better than it was in the 1950s. And that's a Republican Party, by the way, just to hammer this home, that today is nearly 7 in 10 white and Christian in a country that's only 4 in 10 white and Christian. So it has become essentially a white Christian nationalist party under MAGA and Trump.
Can I follow
Those
up
numbers
a
are
little?
stark.
Oh, go ahead, Jamar.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just want to follow up a little bit theologically with something that Kristen said, is that the plan that they've been working on, these are their beliefs. They're deeply committed to these things that you said. And there's this one other piece of it when you were saying, how do we fight that? What do we do about it? And I've really been thinking about the role of violence, which also follows up a little bit on what Robby is saying. But these same people also think it's not that they want violence to accomplish their goals. They actually like violence. And I've been thinking about how much of white Christianity actually extols suffering. Think of like theocratic Catholicism and its ties to something like Opus Dei, when the idea is that it's about creating actually a kind of suffering that becomes your path to salvation. And then I wrote a piece last January about how the evangelical view of salvation was tied up into misery, making people miserable in order to get them saved. And so I was thinking about the language of Russell Vought. We want to traumatize the entire federal workforce, well, and traumatizing the whole United States as part of that. That's just a fun day at the office for these people because they think that it is a they have a theology that not only says that they've had to suffer for salvation, but they have to make you suffer for salvation. And so the inflicting of trauma, violence, and suffering on others, it's like the Middle Ages when the inquisitors would haul someone in and put them on the rack, and the whole point was to get them to repent of their sins. And that's the kind of Christianity, that's the kind of theology that's in the mind of these people, is that the suffering itself will bring about salvation. And they don't care. They don't care if those families are sad today. They don't care if you're traumatized. And they certainly don't care if we get sick and die because of the getting rid of the NIH. It's because the suffering will bring around a greater thing.
Yeah, I think it's that. And then I also think it's something even more crass. Like, I think you're right about that. But I think there's also married up in an odd way to it, just a sort of drunkenness on power and the raw exercise of power and the euphoria that comes from doing it because you can. And like, there's just some of that ugliness in it as well, right? And just this utter disregard, this inhumanity, utter disregard for, the lives that are getting ruined. I mean, when you say like, we're going to reduce the federal workforce, we're going to traumatize, those are people. Those are your fellow American citizens. And here in DC, I mean, I'm living around, so many of my friends are trying to figure out, what are we going to do for health insurance? What are we going to do about childcare? How are we going to like sort our lives out if suddenly, we're out of work?
To traumatize the federal workforce and the country. And I
Yeah.
put out a message like they don't have to be successful in everything they're doing, right? Like the courts can strike some things down, although some will work, just depending on the particular case. Nevertheless, the damage is done. You've already eroded trust in institutions. You've already spooked people who are just civil servants, like not politicians at all, just doing their jobs every day, like most of us do. You've already made it so desirable not to stay in government jobs, particularly federal government jobs, and finding anything, which is exactly what they want. So it's all a bit overwhelming, obviously. I'm sensing that a lot of people are like, okay, what do we do? I don't think we can lay out the plan, right? But I'm wondering, I mean, you can address this a couple of different ways. One, you can talk about what Democrats are doing, or if you're just frustrated about that, you can talk about what faith leaders are doing and what you've seen. Maybe there's actually some positive there in terms of what faith leaders are doing, or um, what you desire from either community, faith leaders or the Democratic Party. So I think we'll start with Kristen.
Oh, well, let me take the Democratic Party. What an utter disappointment. Absolutely failing to rise to the occasion, offering virtually no leadership. And so I think it's a free for all now. I mean, nobody's going to come save us. We need people to step up. We need people to step up. There are a lot of people out there, including a lot of people listening to this podcast, who sense what's happening, who see the danger, and who want to do something, and nobody's directing this. And who's going to step up? I'll nominate somebody. I think Pete Buttigieg could step up right now. He's been a clear voice. He's been a strong voice. I say, Pete, take it away, right? And AOC maybe can join him, and it doesn't have to be Democrats. Anybody else can just get on board and just start leading, right? And I think also the faith communities have an essential role to play in this moment because of the role that faith communities are playing on the other side. And I think they will find, they've got to get their bearings a little bit and find, there's so much going on. So which are the issues that they will mobilize around? There are several to choose from already, right? That's part of the problem. I think we will find too, as we saw last week with Bishop Budde, when there is a clear moral call, people will step up, and the time is now.
That's really helpful. Thank you, especially for naming names about potential Democratic leaders who could step up. Robby, what are your thoughts on responses in this moment?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking a lot about the faith response as well. We did talk about Bishop Budde's response, and I just want to give another shout out to her book, which not coincidentally is titled "How to Be Brave," and it's sold out in hardcover.
Actually, it's kind of supernatural.
Yeah, when I looked last week, it was like number 9 of like all books out there. So if you haven't bought it, buy it. Right, let's kind of keep that train rolling. It's available in audiobook and ebook and all of that. And so that's one way. And we see somebody standing up, we get behind them, right? And that's really one way we can all, and we do it fast. And whatever ways are available to do it, right, to send that message. And then I've seen some other things. So here in Maryland, there was a suit filed by the meek and mighty Quakers here, and they picked something that is still a little under the radar, perhaps, but really important. And it was that the Trump administration, I'm speaking of cruelty, undermined a longstanding policy under both Democratic and Republican presidents that ICE would not seek to arrest people at what are called sensitive locations. Now, that meant schools, churches, and hospitals. Now, think about this for a minute. Why is that policy in place? Right? Well, for one, we value religious liberty and we value religious communities. And we did not want people who are here struggling to kind of make their way in the country to be fearful about joining a local community and integrating it's one way to kind of integrate into American society. The other one is obviously hospitals and schools. We did not want people to be afraid to pick their kid up from school, right? To be scared they were going to be arrested, right? Or to send their kid to school. And then hospitals. Now think about this one for a moment. Your kid has an emergency and you are undocumented. You're going to have to choose between getting your kid emergency health care and putting your own life at risk, right? It's an awful thing. And a good government doesn't do that, right? A good government realizes, yes, there are laws, there's enforcement, all that's important, but we try to take the harshest edges off of, even laws that we have. And that's what both, again, Democratic and Republican presidents have done. And yet this has been repealed. So I've seen, and so they're basically suing, saying this interferes with our free practice of religion, that if we can't hold a safe place for people to come, that is fundamental to our religious identity. So that's just like one small thing. We've actually seen Cardinal Dolan speak up, call J.D. Vance out for implying that Catholics only help refugees because they're paid huge sums of money to do it, despite the fact that that's been central to Catholic social teaching and faith and practice for decades and decades and decades, right? And here's J.D. Vance, Catholic convert, saying that and getting called out by Dolan, who's a Trump supporter, right? So that's really notable as well. So those are just two I'll throw out that I do think it is the case that people are trying to be careful and pick their moments and try to pick things that are strategically impactful. So we don't see them right away, but there are things happening. And when we see those things, I think it is incumbent upon all of us to really jump in and say yes, yes, yes to this.
Diana, you'll have the last word, but I'll just chime in here. One of the things that I think is imperative for us to think about is this is the long game. So if our lens is if we don't get a hot take within minutes or hours of something happening, then quote unquote, nobody's doing anything. That's not a helpful lens to have. Some of these things are going to go to trial. They'll take months, if not years, to work themselves out. Some of these things are being organized right now. I mean, we're only 2 weeks into this thing at this point, and it'll take a while. They're deepening roots going down, and it'll take a while before the stem of the plant comes up and can be seen publicly. So I would caution us to think that, in the social media environment, just because you aren't seeing an immediate response from folks doesn't mean nothing's happening. At the same time, I'm concerned. I was with 2 or 3 different gatherings of faith leaders last week in the wake of the inauguration, and particularly for Black folks, we just haven't used the language of white Christian nationalism as much. And that's okay. We're still addressing issues of racism and authoritarianism in Christianity. But there's also this web of organizations. I'm really thinking that the church in general, not just Black church, we are on our heels because we don't realize this is a global enterprise to lift up authoritarianism, and that the 0.00001% are not doing this in isolation in their own nation. They're getting together with people from across the globe and saying, here's the playbook. And these are meetings that we'll never hear about, never see, will never be covered by journalists, and yet they're happening. Investigative journalists have brought this out. People have been talking about authoritarianism for decades and decades. They brought it out. And it's here. And I don't see a lot of churches, whether denominations or local congregations, talking about the scale, the coordination, the money, the secrecy, the will to power. So I just think we have zero clue in general what we're really up against, and that's what really concerns me. But Diana, closing thoughts on democratic responses or faith responses here.
Well, I would like to point out that something really positive did happen this week in relationship to that attempt to impound federal funds and freeze the federal government. And that is, I have no idea how many millions of people called Congress, but they were besieged literally by phone calls and email and text and every way that anybody could reach their congressperson. And it was in Democratic districts and for Democratic senators, and same for Republicans and Republican senators. And within 24 hours, we did see the Trump administration back down and then say, well, we're not going to do this particular thing. And what that showed me was that the politicians are still responding to the pressure of their constituents who are threatening them with the loss of their positions. And so there is one thing in Washington that's normal. And as long as that's normal, that's not so bad. And that means people do have some power still, and they should deploy it without reservation by keeping on their representatives, for the Democrats to grow a spine and for the Republicans to stop hurting people. And so I think that was really incredibly hopeful, and they will come back. It's not the end of that attempt. They'll do it different ways, but the first round got sort of set aside. And the other thing I'd just like to encourage people to do is that I think there's kind of two tasks for faith communities. And one is what I call the pooper scooper task. And that is that the Trump administration is, just creating all of this terrible, flotsam of pain. And that churches are the only people who can go behind this and start picking up the suffering, the broken, the wounded, the people who are crying, and all that kind of on the ground work, triage work that needs to be done with human hearts. And so that's really important. And I think that places are starting to realize, oh, we're really going to have to do this. And then the second piece is what I would call the Mariann Budde approach, and that is the words to power piece. And Jim Acosta just left CNN, and in the process of leaving CNN, he made this comment about how, yes, the job is to speak truth to power, but that is a difficult thing to do when power only wants to come down on words, to squash the truth. And so I'd say stand up for truth everywhere, constantly, without giving in. Know what you're seeing is what you are seeing. Read good sources. Trust the people you trust. And do not let yourself be gaslit. So proud of people who called Congress. We do have some power. Let's use what we have. And then for faith communities, do the pooper scooper task, because that has to happen. But also, you've got some prophetic work to do around things that every one of us have talked about tonight.
Well, obviously, so much more to talk about. There's a constant deluge of new information and current events, but that's going to do it for this episode of the Convocation Unscripted. On behalf of me and my co-hosts, thank you for joining us. And remember to subscribe to our newsletter, convocation.substack.com, and our individual Substacks are in the show notes. We'll see you at the next Convocation.